aware, is about the new Housing Stabilization Services that are going to be online July 2020 through DHS. I want to make sure everyone knows you've seen the audio. Probably after these 10 minutes, you figured it out, or if you figure, but that first slide there kind of talks about how to access the audio and other features. We're going to get going here, it looks like, with the business at hand today. So we have Becky Malang and Becca Koffenberg-Satry and Mark Caldwell here from the DHS Housing Division to walk us through the Housing Stabilization Services. I'm going to turn it over to them. We're going to field questions through the chat. You can send it to all panelists, and I will be cutting and pasting, copying those questions that as you send them, and then we're going to address them all at the end of this presentation.
So hi everyone, this is Becca Koffenberg-Satry. I'm here, as Adrian said, with my colleagues Mark Caldwell and Becky Malang. We will be presenting for about 45 minutes, then we're going to take a 3-minute break, and then we will be moving into the question and answer. As we're going through the presentation, please submit any questions you have through the chat feature throughout the presentation. During the 10-minute break, we will allow the first 3 minutes for additional questions, and after that time, questions will not be answered during this presentation. So during that 10-minute break, we'll be organizing the questions, and then we will come back and we will spend some time answering questions that we can. Please avoid acronyms in your questions, as it makes it very difficult to answer if we're not sure what the acronyms mean. So thank you so much for joining us. We will be recording and posting the presentation component of the webinar. We will not be recording the Q&A, just so you know, but you will be able to access the presentation online. So we are talking about Housing Stabilization Services. It is a new Medicaid benefit that will be available July 2020, and it's designed to help people with disabilities and seniors find and keep housing. Just 1 minute here. I'm going to see if we can clean. There we go. All right, so presentation overview. First, we will be talking a bit about the background. Then we'll be talking about eligibility and assessment for people to access these services. Next, we'll talk about services and requirements, including the transition and sustaining services, the housing consultation service and person-centered planning, home and community-based setting requirements, as well as the conflict of interest. We will then go in to talk about provider qualifications and enrollment, the impact this will have on other services we already have here at DHS, and as well as then we will go into some examples of how people will access services and the timeline for implementation. And now I am going to hand it over to Becky Malang to talk through the history of these services as well as the eligibility and assessment piece.
Thank you, Becca. Again, my name is Becky Malang, and I'm going to start us off by talking a little bit about the history of where the services started from. So most of us know, and if you don't, you do now, that access to safe, quality, affordable housing and the supports necessary to maintain that housing constitutes one of the most basic and powerful social determinants of health. We're really making the connection between housing and health. We know that high prevalence of serious health conditions among homeless populations, the lack of access to housing can lead to extended stays in healthcare institutions. A lack of stable housing has negative impacts on health, and a move to stable housing can result in decrease in emergency services and an increase in primary care use. Because of all of these things, we have created a new, because we're looking at this through how housing and healthcare really interact. We have worked with the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services to create a new Medicaid benefit called Housing Stabilization Services to help individuals find and maintain housing. So how can Housing Stabilization Services help? People with disabilities often lack the support they need to live successfully in the community. Affordable housing is not always enough for a person with a disability to be able to find and maintain housing. Mental illness, symptoms, physical health conditions, and development or learning disabilities can make it difficult to search for and secure housing, interact with landlords and neighbors, and understand and follow a lease. The right supports provided by a professional with knowledge and experience in housing can help resolve barriers. I want to take a second to point out, and we'll point this out a couple times throughout the PowerPoint in the presentation, that one of the things that we aren't addressing in this presentation and with these services is paying for housing. So we're really talking about the ability to find and maintain housing, but this service does not cover any sort of cost to pay for housing at all. So that is another bucket of money that is often at Minnesota Housing, and there's other places to do that. So how did we get started on this path at DHS? Well, looking back over the past really 9 years that it's taken us to get to the point that we are today with this service. The first thing that really helped was in 2011, Medicaid expanded to non-disabled single adults. This meant that we really were able to see a lot of people that were experiencing homelessness, and that population be added on to Medicaid off of the other healthcare that we had at that time, and we're really able to create services for individuals that are more than just the traditional Medicaid population. In 2012, we made our first proposal around housing services in Reform 2020. That did not go very far. There are certain pieces of Reform 2020 that did get passed, but the housing piece was not passed at that time. Then in 2015, CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, put a bulletin out on coverage of housing-related services. So they said they'd be willing to cover services related to helping people find and maintain housing. And they listed the exact services that we're going to be covering. That same year, Minnesota's Olmsted Plan and the Plan to Prevent and End Homelessness both included similar services around exploring housing-related services in Medicaid. Both those plans, that Olmsted Plan, which is looking at moving people out of institutions and into having more choice in the community, stated that to reach that goal, they needed services, more services, to help people find that housing and stay in that housing. And the Plan to End Homelessness said to get more people off the streets and into their own housing, they also needed services, more services to help people do this. In 2016, Minnesota State Legislature requested a study on housing-related services in Medicaid, and so the Department of Human Services started our work on looking at what that would be. And then housing access coordination was added to people in the 1915C disability waiver. And then in 2017, we created the final legislation, and the Minnesota State Legislature authorized DHS to seek federal approval for Housing Stabilization Services. And then now in 2019, which isn't on here, CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, approved that application. And here we are today working on implementing that application. So as you can see, it's a pretty quick process to get new Medicaid services passed and through both the state legislature, the federal government, and everything. So even though it may feel sometimes like we're moving a little bit slow, we're actually, in our minds, we're going quite fast. So here we are, 2019, and we will be having an implementation date of July 1, 2020. The goals of this service are, one, to support an individual's transition to housing, to increase long-term stability in housing, and to avoid future periods of homelessness and institutionalization. Now let's talk about the target population. The target population, as you heard earlier when we talked about both the Olmsted Plan, which is looking at deinstitutionalizing people, and our Plan to End Homelessness, which is looking at helping people move into housing out of homelessness, our target population is incredibly broad with these services, which make it incredibly, you can't be incredibly unique, correcting myself, but makes it very unique to DHS. We're looking across all of our areas and saying we wanted a service that would help people in all different parts of their life, in all different types of disability. One thing to point out is that it is only for adults, so you have to be of the age 18 to receive the services, but that after that, the age is up until you pass away. So our target population, here's 4 examples. 1, you could be a youth who's 18 years old, temporarily staying with family after a stay in an intensive residential treatment facility due to bipolar disorder, or a senior living in an emergency shelter and suffering from chronic lung disease and diabetes. Or you could be a person with a developmental disability living in a corporate foster care who wants to live independently. Or a mom living in an apartment with her 2 kids but facing eviction within the next month due to behaviors related to her mental illness and substance use. And all of these individuals would qualify for these services. And later on in our presentation, we'll walk you through how each of these people would go through that process. So as I stated, how do you have to be eligibility for Housing Stabilization Services fits all those people, and here are what we're looking at. So first, you have to be on medical assistance, and you have to be 18 years or older. And then the next 3 things must also apply. You have to have all these 3. A disability or disabling condition, housing instability, and a need for services due to limitations caused by the individual's disability. In the next few slides, we're going to go through these in depth. So disability or disabling condition. If you're familiar with one of our services called housing support, you might be familiar with the disabling condition term. For those of you who aren't familiar with the disabling condition, we're going to walk into it a little bit. The disabling condition is terminology that we use that is written in our state legislation around access to housing support and other services that DHS provides. This also includes aged, blind, or disabled as described under Title II of the Social Security Act of SSI and SSDI, and people determined by a medical professional to have any of the following conditions: a long-term injury or illness, mental illness, developmental disability, a learning disability, or substance use disorder. Anybody that falls under one of those conditions, as long as it's a disabling condition, this is not the level of SSI. So if you're looking at the blue book for SSI and you're thinking we have to hit that level, this is not the case at all. If you're thinking you have to hit the same level that you would for targeted case management, this is not. This is a lower level. This is looking at somebody who has a disabling condition. The really big thing that we want to do when we go into the next slide is showing that this disabling condition is impacting their ability to keep and maintain housing. So for the proof of disability, we have several different areas that we can do that. One is the professional statement of need. This is a form that we're currently using for housing support that we're modifying to use for the new services. There will be one big change on that if you're familiar with this form. Because this is a Medicaid service, we will no longer be using the county reps as an option to sign off in this form. It will need to be signed by a professional who is in the field of the disability they are signing off on, and that information is on our website. We can also use a medical opinion form, a proof of receipt of SSI or SSDI, or other forms of disability documentation will be determined as well. So the next thing, after we know that they have a disabling condition or disability, is housing instability. Housing instability falls under 4 different areas. That they meet the Minnesota's definition for homeless, that they're at risk of homelessness, currently transitioning or have recently transitioned from an institution or licensed or registered setting, or they're eligible for waiver services. Any of these will work. At risk of homelessness is just that, at risk of homelessness. You do not need to fit a very narrow definition that is described by HUD. This is our definition for the state of Minnesota. At risk of homelessness could be they're unable to pay their rent, that their landlord has told them they're going to be evicted. We do not need proof of anything like that. So with documentation, it will be much simpler than possibly the way they're used to documenting homelessness in the past. Our professional statement of needs, again, that document that we have mentioned before that we're using for housing support is being modified to capture this. The individual themselves can check a box stating that they are homeless or at risk of homelessness and sign off to verify it on that form. If somebody is transitioning or recently transitioned from an institution or licensed setting and have already gone through min choices to show that they're eligible either for waiver services or that they're transitioning, if they have documentation, any of those would be helpful, and you could use those as well. And coordinated entry assessment for a person experiencing homelessness, if they go through coordinated entry, that's another entry point that can document housing instability. So all of these ways can document that. And you only need one. So if you're experiencing homelessness, you don't need to go through min choices. And if you are on a waiver and have gone through min choices, you don't need to go through the homeless coordinated entry system. Individuals just go through their own system that they're already going through. We're really wanting to catch people where they already are. If people aren't already going or connected, then the professional statement of need would be the best option, and we'll talk about that again later on. But we're really trying to meet people at a point where they're connecting to the system already instead of having to create another entry point to the system. So after we have those two things, the third thing is the assessed need for service. So we know that they have a disability. We know that they have housing instability, but now we have to show that they need the services. And that's by saying one of these, checking these areas off. So the assessed need is one, that they require assistance due to their disability in one of the following areas: communication, mobility, decision-making, or managing challenging behaviors. We're going to have to do an assessment around the need for these services so that we can document that they need help in that area. Again, we're adding these questions to the professional statement of need. So, yep, we're modifying that PSN to fit all these three areas in it, and that professional statement of need will still be front and back, so it'll be a simple form, so that will be on there as well. Min choices assessment, so looking at min choices assessment to use that as a tool as well to capture that. And coordinate entry as well. So we're really looking at those three tools to get that information and streamline it and get it into where we need to go. So after you collect these three forms of documentation and you have seen that they have the disability, they have housing instability, and they have an assessed need for the services, we're going to look at the eligibility review system flow. So you would collect these, and then a provider is going to submit those documents and assessment outcomes into a state-run eligibility system. The current option is an online form with attachments. So this is looking at a provider submitting it themselves, not through the county, but through themselves. The county is not involved in the system at all, and an online option to go on and upload documents. Once they upload those documents, the provider uploads them into the system, they will actually just go to the Department of Human Services, and DHS staff ourselves will review documents and notify providers if that person has been approved or denied. If that person is denied, a notification form will be sent to the person seeking services and the provider, letting them know why and how to resolve that issue. After we review it, if they're found eligible, DHS is going to turn that service on, and they're going to, the provider is going to receive approval that they can bill through Minutes portal for all fee-for-service recipients. Now, the service is not going just through DHS fee-for-service, it's also going through managed care organizations. So if the person that you're providing services for is with a managed care organization, that will be going through the managed care organization itself. You'll still submit the information to the Department of Human Services, letting us know. We'll still do approval, but we will then let ourselves tell the managed care organization that that person is approved, and the managed care organization will contact you and let you know that you are able to bill for that person and turn that service on. So with that, we're going to go into service and requirements, and I'm going to hand it off to Becca to walk through what exactly the services are.
Hi, this is Becca Koffenberg-Satry, and like Becky said, I'm going to talk through the housing services requirements as well as home and community-based service requirements, which are requirements through the Center for Medicare and Medicaid related to the type of service application this is. So first, Housing Stabilization Services. These services have two primary services, and those are transition and sustaining. The transition service helps people plan for, find, and move to homes of their own in the community. And the sustaining service supports a person to maintain living in their home in the community. I like to point out that these services are not sequential, so a person who is living in their home and never used transition services but is at risk of losing their housing and is eligible can move directly on to sustaining services. So a little bit more information on the housing transition services. Community supports they are community supports that help people plan for, find, and move into the housing. Then there is, so the parts of the services, creating a housing transition plan, assisting with the housing search and application processes, resolving barriers to accessing housing, securing additional services, including benefits and resources to support housing, helping a person organize their move and ensure the new living arrangement is safe and move-in ready. And again, these services do not pay for goods such as security deposits or furnishings, room and board, or rent. Medicaid services pay for the person to support the person to stay in their housing, but do not pay for housing. Housing sustaining services. So these are community supports that help a person maintain housing. Some things that this will include is creating a housing stabilization plan, educating on roles, rights, and responsibilities as a tenant and those of the property manager and landlords, maintain key relationships with the property managers, landlords, and their neighbors, advocacy with community resources to prevent eviction when housing is at risk, as well as prevention and early identification of behaviors that may jeopardize continued housing, assistance with maintaining services and supports, including applying for helping the person apply for benefits to retain housing, and supporting the building of natural housing supports and resources in the community. So really looking at, what connections within the community can you support that person to make so that they can successfully have their own relationships and their own supports that aren't paid supports. Again, these services do not pay for goods such as security deposits or furnishings or room and board or rent. The other service that is included in the Housing Stabilization Service is a housing consultation service. And this is a new planning service available through Housing Stabilization Services that will provide a person-centered plan for people without Medicaid-funded case management. And we'll go into more detail about what this means in the next slide. The housing consultant will update the plans annually. So this person will need their plan updated annually, and if they're using the housing consultant will update the plan annually, or more frequently if the person requests a plan change, experiences a major change of circumstance, or wants to change their housing stabilization provider, so the person providing them with housing transition or housing sustaining services. So housing stabilization services, again, are home and community-based services and must meet all CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, home and community-based requirements. One of these requirements is that a person must have a person-centered plan. So home and community-based services, person-centered plan requirements. Everyone receiving housing stabilization services will be required to have a person-centered service plan. The person-centered planning process must be driven by the individual, include the person's strengths, interests, and wants, as well as the supports they need. And this is key. They must help the person make an informed choice about their housing stabilization, transition, or sustaining provider. So the person who's doing this plan is also going to help them decide who would be a good provider to help them move into their new home or keep them in their home. So additional person-centered requirements, the person must have choice of service delivery and provider, as well as where they live and the living arrangements. Must be driven by the person, have personally defined outcomes. It must be written in plain language and reflect cultural considerations. It must take into account their well-being and contribute to the assurance of health and welfare. And this is really where it comes into having choice and having their wants and strengths acknowledged as well as their needs. And it must mitigate risk factors. It also must be integrated in the community. People must have the right to seek employment in competitive settings, so in the open job market, and they must have the opportunity to engage in community and control personal resources. So who does this person-centered plan? You probably noticed I said if somebody has Medicaid-funded case management, they won't use a housing consultant, and that is true because Medicaid case management already is required to do planning for people and support them to access services. So if people already have that service, it would be duplicative for them to use a housing consultation provider. So who does the person-centered plan? Current roles required to complete the plan are the waiver case manager, the targeted case manager. This includes adult mental health, child mental health, vulnerable adult developmental disability, as well as child welfare targeted case managers. The other group that will be doing this is senior care coordinators who work with our seniors to take them through the long-term care consultation process, which will also assess for these services, and their plan also meets the requirements for this person-centered plan. New service for people who do not have Medicaid case management or care coordination, senior will use the enrolled housing consultation provider. So the new housing-focused person-centered plan format, this is going to be a new DHS-developed form for targeted case managers and our housing consultation providers. It will contain basic information, so this is what the plan will look like. We're leaving it, it's not going to be an incredibly cumbersome or long plan. This is what it includes. Basic information, so the plan developer information, then contact information for the person, healthcare provider information, so if the person has an MCO, that will be named, emergency contact information, as well as if somebody has a guardian or an alternative decision maker information. It will include the person's goals and strengths, housing services and supports required, as well as helping the person make an informed choice of provider and making sure that that provider has signed this person-centered plan. So the provider who will go on to perform the housing transition or housing sustaining service will also be required to sign the plan, so we know that connection has been made. It'll go through some brief non-housing related support information. So for instance, if the person wants to work, it would just simply be referring them to vocational rehabilitation services or the workforce center, connecting them to supports that could help them find employment. They'll look a bit at risk mitigation, and there'll be signatures. Again, this plan is going to be, there'll be a template and a format that will be used for this plan. That will be an e-doc and a fillable form to make it as easy as possible to get this plan done so people can move on to getting the services that they need. Waiver case managers and senior care coordinators will use the plans they currently use, and these services will simply be added as a service option into those current plans. More home and community-based service. So there is setting requirements. So where the person lives must meet these requirements. The person must be living in or planning to transition to a setting that is integrated in and support full access to the greater community, protect rights of privacy, dignity, and respect, and be free from coercion and restraint. It must optimize autonomy and independence to make life choices, and they must have choice in services and supports and who provides them. I'm going to go into a little bit more into the provider-controlled settings next. So for people living in housing that their service provider owns, the housing must meet these additional requirements. The person must have a lease or a lease equivalent. Each individual must have privacy in their sleeping or living unit. Units must have entrance doors that are lockable by the person with only appropriate staff having keys to the doors. They must, if they are sharing units, they must have choice of roommates in that setting. Individuals must have the freedom to furnish and decorate their sleeping or living units within the lease or other agreements. Individuals have the freedom to control their own schedules and activities and have access to food at any time. Individuals are able to have visitors of their choosing at any time, and the setting is physically accessible to the individual. Another home and community-based service requirement is a conflict of interest requirement. And what this conflict of interest says is the same provider can provide the assessment and also do the housing-focused person-centered plan for the person. But that provider cannot also provide housing transition and sustaining services. So if a person or in a provider has done the assessment or the housing-focused plan, a different provider will be required to do the housing transition and sustaining service. For the home and community-based conflict of interest requirements, there is a conflict of interest exception that will be required for a provider agency to do both the assessment plan, excuse me, as well as the transition sustaining service for the same person. The conflict of interest exceptions are only for provider shortage areas by geographic area. So if there's an area of the state that doesn't have enough providers providing these services, or if there's a shortage of provider due for cultural or language specific providers. So if there's providers who are providing services to a specific cultural or language purpose and there's not enough providers in that area that serve that population, then they'll also be eligible to apply for an exception. And providers will submit an exception request to DHS to determine if they can waive the conflict of interest. Providers can always be enrolled and provide both housing consultation and housing transition sustaining service. They just cannot provide them to the same person if the provider doesn't have a conflict of interest exception. I'm now going to hand it over to Mark to discuss provider qualification, rates, provider enrollment, and he's going to walk us through some examples of how people may use these services.
Thanks, Becca. So this is Mark Caldwell, and I'll start by going over the provider qualifications, rates, and the enrollment process. First, with regard to provider qualifications, we'll be talking about the housing transition and sustaining providers. So these providers need to have knowledge of local housing resources. They need to complete an online training for housing and transition and sustaining. They need to complete a mandated reporter training on vulnerable adults and pass a criminal background study. The knowledge of local housing resources will be part of an attestation that is a document that's submitted as you enroll for services. The mandated reporter training and criminal background studies are already developed and in use for other services, and we'll talk more about the specific training for our program on the coming slides. With regard to provider qualifications for housing consultation, they are very similar. They'll need to have a knowledge of local housing resources, have completed a specific online training for housing consultation, pass a criminal background study, and they must not have a direct or indirect financial interest in the housing that participant selects. Now we're going to talk about the specific housing and transition and sustaining training that all eligible providers will have to complete in order to provide these services. Currently, this is in development with an estimated completion date of May 1st, 2020. This training will be available online through TrainLink and will be required for all staff providing direct service. There is no fee to complete this training. Provider leadership must sign an assurance statement assuring all staff complete training to become an enrolled provider. Provider agencies will be required to hold certificates of training completion for all staff who provide these services. Review of certificates will be a component of DHS monitoring. So how will you enroll as a Housing Stabilization Services provider? The first thing is you're going to prepare. Providers must make sure all documents have been completed prior to enrollment, and providers must attest that all individuals have completed required trainings by holding certificates of completion. The training, as I said, is currently being developed and will be housed on TrainLink. And if you are a brand new provider, you may need to know how to enroll first as an MA provider and the required steps to do so. Second, you'll actually enroll through our Minnesota Provider Screening Enrollment Portal, or the MPSE. You may choose to enroll both as a housing consultant and housing transition sustaining provider. you will need to re-enroll for these services every 5 years. The documents that you'll need are an assurance statement, a service request form, and a provider enrollment application related to home and community-based services. Lastly, this information will be shared. So there'll be a specific file sent to managed care organizations that send out the list of providers enrolled in these services. The hope is that as providers enroll as early as May 1st, 2020, once these lists are completed and compiled through the MPS system, they will actually be sent out to MCOs earlier so that providers and MCOs can start working together to effectively determine how services will be coordinated. Now we'll talk about the rates. So this is Housing Stabilization Services, the specific fee-for-service rate. If you are providing transition or sustaining services, you will be compensated $17.17 per 15-minute unit with a limit of 150 hours per transition, and for sustaining, a limit of 150 hours annually. If you're providing consultation, you will get $174.22 per session. At enrollment and then annually, or if there's a major change in circumstances or upon request of recipient, will there be another consultation that's able to be used. For enrolled housing consultation providers only, and this is case managers will not be able to bill. It's also important to note that there will be a 150-hour exception for people with high barriers to housing. What you see in the upper right-hand corner is a grayed out box because it's important to note that these rates are fee-for-service only. DHS will contract with managed care organizations to provide housing stabilization services for their members. And as a result, providers interested in providing our services will have to enroll in MCOs, and MCOs will work with providers to determine the payment rates specifically for them. So it's clear that these rates we're providing are fee-for-service rates, and other rates may be set in relationship with the MCOs you're working with. So what can you do now? Provider enrollment. Ensure your clients are receiving medical assistance and develop a process to help them with benefit continuity. Get to know the MCOs in your area. If you're not currently billing for Medicaid services, connect with providers who are to understand their billing processes. Explore Minnesota Healthcare Program's provider manual to understand the provider requirements. So I'm going to move on to the next section called Impact on Other Services. Housing Stabilization Services and Other Services. Housing stabilization will duplicate these services. Housing access coordination in the 1915C waivers. These will be removed from waivers and recipients will access through the state plan. People will transition on to housing stabilization services from housing access coordination at their annual renewal with their waiver case manager. Recipients will not be allowed to receive housing stabilization services and the following services at the same time: relocation service coordination, assertive community treatment, or moving home Minnesota. Housing stabilization services will partially duplicate housing support supplemental services. Recipients receiving housing support in the community settings will have a supplemental service rate adjustment of 50% starting in July 2021. Continuing on with housing stabilization services and other services, housing stabilization services will not duplicate these services. If more intensive housing-related services are needed, clients receiving these services listed below should be referred to housing stabilization services. A person can receive these services, which I will mention briefly, and our housing stabilization services. So if you're receiving ARMS, targeted case management, which is not housing consultation, 1915C waivers, not housing consultation, semi-independent living services, behavioral health homes, or healthcare care coordination through Substance Use Disorder Reform Services, or CCBHC, you may also receive our housing stabilization services at the same time. Additionally, housing-related grant programs. Adults who are in grant-funded programs and eligible for Housing Stabilization Services should be referred to our services, but they may also continue to receive grant-funded services if those services fall outside those covered by Housing Stabilization Services, such as support with chemical dependency recovery. For our final section, we're going to go back to the examples we mentioned in the beginning and then end with the timeline of implementation. The first slide I'm showing you is a broad overview of the steps that someone would take to access our services. So on the left, you see eligible person, and then we'll go through a flow chart with 4 clear boxes identifying how they're going to get access to services. First and foremost, in the top box, they will be assessed. And in that assessment process, they'll utilize either their professional statement of need, their min choices or long-term care consultation, or their coordinated entry assessment. Additionally, you may get a coordinated care plan if you're part of the senior population that's often associated with the elderly waiver. The second box shows the planning phase. In this phase, someone will work with the eligible person to develop their plan. This plan could either be a housing-focused person-centered plan, if they're working with a housing consultant or targeted case manager. It could be a community services and support plan with a waiver case manager, or as I mentioned before, it could be a coordinated care plan if you're part of that senior population. Once the assessment and the planning process is complete, the Housing Stabilization Services provider will submit that documentation to our eligibility review system run through the state. That eligibility review process will entail a review of the submitted documentation, and once that documentation is deemed verified, they will notify the provider that they can start working with that person with the hopeful outcome that the person has a place of their own in the community and a plan that supports them to avoid future stays in other areas. So that was a broad discussion of how anyone could access services. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to talk about the specific examples mentioned earlier. In our first example, we had an 18-year-old youth who was temporarily staying with a family after a stay in an intensive residential treatment facility due to bipolar disorder. In this example, the first step would be that intensive residential treatment social worker would sign the professional statement of need and refer that youth to housing consultation provider. That housing consultation provider then completes the housing-focused person-centered plan and helps the youth to determine the provider they want to work with, continuing in transition. The housing consultation provider collects documentation verifying eligibility and submits verifications and plan to DHS for review. They receive reimbursement as a one-time session fee once that documentation has been approved by our eligibility review staff. Once that step has been complete, that 18-year-old youth can then work with a housing transition or sustaining provider to ensure they get access to their own apartment with potential housing subsidies, and they can provide up to 150 hours of ongoing support per year. Moving on to example 2. In this example, we have a senior living in an emergency shelter and suffering from chronic lung disease and diabetes. As a first step, a homeless outreach worker might refer the senior to coordinated entry. The coordinated entry assessor may be enrolled as a housing consultant. They then could complete the coordinated entry assessment and housing-focused plan and help the senior to choose a provider. The person wants to continue working with their outreach worker who is enrolled in housing and transition sustaining services. What would need to happen is the coordinated entry assessor, who is also potentially the housing consultant, would need to collect that documentation verifying eligibility, which would be including the receipt of SSI, and they would need to submit the verifications and plan to DHS for review. Once they receive approval for that, the housing consultant would be able to receive reimbursement as a one-time session fee for the assessment planning process. Going forward, a housing transition sustaining provider would be able to support that person to find housing. They would then continue to support them at 150 hours annually in order to stay in that housing. Moving on to example 3. In this example, we find a person with a developmental disability and they're living in corporate foster care, but they want to live independently. So this person calls their waiver case manager to discuss other options for their living situation. In box 2, the waiver case manager reviews the person's min choices assessment and sees that they meet the requirements for assessed need for services. They update the person's CSSP to include Housing Stabilization Services and help the person choose a provider. In the next box, the person chooses a Housing Transition and Sustaining Services provider to help them with the move. The Housing Transition and Sustaining provider collects documentation verifying eligibility, again including receipt of SSI, and submits verifications and plan to DHS for review. Once that approval has taken place, the Housing Transition and Sustaining provider helps the person to find their own apartment and provides up to 150 hours of ongoing support per year. The person also receives other services through their waiver. The outcome here is the person has their own home integrated in the community, and it can avoid, hopefully, future periods of institutionalization. For our last example, we'll cover a mother living in an apartment with her 2 children, but she's facing eviction within the next month due to behaviors related to her mental illness and substance use. So, this mother would work with a mental health targeted case manager who recognizes this would be a supportive service. The targeted case manager completes the person's professional statement of need and the housing-focused person-centered plan, and then helps the person to choose a provider. The person selects a housing transition and sustaining provider to work with. The targeted case manager securely emails documentation verifying eligibility and the plan to the housing transition and sustaining provider. The housing transition and sustaining provider will need to submit that verification and plan to DHS for review. Once that has been approved, that transition and sustaining provider can provide up to 150 hours of ongoing support per year to help the mother and her 2 children stay in their apartment. The long-term outcome is this person is able to maintain stable housing in the community and avoid future periods of homelessness. To conclude our presentation today, I'd just like to go over the timeline for implementation from approximately when we're approved to July 2020 as our launch date. On this timeline, you'll see that our first box on the bottom says August 2019. That's when our services were approved by the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services. Here we are in December 2019. What we're currently doing is working to develop the provider enrollment and also ongoing eligibility system, which will be developed through July 2020. Looking at January to March 2020, we're going to be continuously developing that provider training, which should be ready by May 2020. And we're going to do stakeholder engagement with organizations and state agencies around implementation processes. In April 2020, providers will actually be able to enroll through the Minnesota Provider Screening and Enrollment Portal for these services. At that time, we'll also be doing regional outreach to providers about service requirements. From May 2020 to July 2020, we'll have ongoing provider outreach related to billing, provider enrollment, and recipient eligibility. Provider training will be available on TrainLink to be completed by all staff at an agency or organization. And then as of July 2020, services will become available. And it's important to note that we will continuously do ongoing training and outreach to providers and state agencies as these services roll out. What we're going to do now is we're going to take approximately 10 minutes to review your questions. And as noted before, you can submit questions up to 3 minutes after I kind of conclude this discussion, but then we won't take any more questions. Then we'll spend about 10 minutes processing and organizing these questions, and then we'll actually respond to the questions based on the sections that they were asked. So this is Mark Caldwell, just saying thank you very much for taking the time to attend this webinar, and we'll get back to you in approximately 15 minutes with the responses to your questions.
So now we're going to give 3 minutes from right now to type in more questions. After that, we'll be closing off and taking a 10-minute break. And we will be stopping the recording right now. Thank you. So we